Good morning. It's great to be here together to worship the Lord. If you're visiting with us, we're so glad that you are here. And you can help us out a little bit by following the instructions on the screen behind me, giving us a record of your presence here. That helps us get to know you a little bit better. And we hope that we'll be able to visit with you a little today, and hope that today will be an uplifting time for you and an encouraging time for you. We started a series couple weeks ago on Sunday night, Marriage in the Old Testament. And I wanted to do this on Sunday nights, but I looked at my calendar. I don't have many Sunday nights left. I've got tonight, and then I want to get another Q&A time in, so we're going to do that the fourth Sunday night. And then we're going to switch over to our open home meeting schedule. And so I wanted to try to get more of these teachings of the Old Testament about marriage in. And so I decided to handle that this morning and tonight. And so we'll be talking about marriage in the Old Testament, and the book of the Old Testament we'll spend the entirety of this morning's lesson in is the book of Proverbs. I don't know if you've realized how much there is about marriage in the book of Proverbs. And the advice, as you would expect, is very practical, because Proverbs is a book, we all know, that's about wisdom. And let me say a few things about wisdom before we get into the specific text on marriage in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom, we usually say, is applied knowledge, and that's true, that the application of knowledge is wisdom. But I want you to think of it from a different point of view. One way to look at knowledge is we gain knowledge in order to control our environment. That's the goal of science. Learn as much as we can about the world we live in, about the universe, and use that information to try to control our environment. The goal of government is to gather information to try to control our enemies. And so what one view of knowledge is that we try to gain knowledge in order to control our reality, control everything around us. But there's some things that just can't be controlled. And that takes a lot of knowledge also. Maybe it's controllable, but it would take you a lifetime to learn how to do it. The book of Proverbs looks at knowledge a little differently in terms of wisdom. And the book of Proverbs says we gain knowledge not to control reality, but to navigate it successfully. You see the difference? It's not trying to change the reality, but it's understanding reality and how to operate successfully in it. And so that's how the book of Proverbs addresses every issue, including marriage. It's going to look at the realities about human relationships, the realities about love, the reality about communication, the reality about all kinds of aspects affecting marriage and families, and not trying to control it and usurp it for ourselves, but to navigate it successfully. God instituted marriage, and we looked in the last lesson on this topic at Genesis chapter 2, where marriage is created. And we see that that ideal is carried forward throughout the Old and New Testament. So as we look at Proverbs today, think about that. We're not trying to learn how to change marriage so that it suits our pleasure, not learning how to control the other person. We're going to look at the reality of what God has established and learn how to navigate it successfully. So where do we start? Well, we're going to start on the negative and look at two pitfalls that we're warned about in the book of Proverbs, two pitfalls for marriage. And the first one is adultery. If you turn over to Proverbs chapter 5, we see that there is talk here about the marriage relationship and how it's not just for procreation, but physical intimacy in a marriage relationship can also be for pleasure and joy and happiness. He says in chapter 5, verse 15, "Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love." He's saying, be true to your wife, or be true to your husband, and be faithful, because verse 20 continues, Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? Adultery is physical intimacy with someone who is not your spouse, extramarital affairs and such. And the warning here from parent to son in Proverbs chapter 5 is, be faithful to your spouse. That's who God has given you to enjoy life with. There are practical consequences of adultery, and he talks about this in general in verses 27 and through 29 of chapter 6. And then he goes into detail. So in chapter 6, verse 27, he asks, can a man carry fire next to his chest and his clothes not be burned? Or can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? So is he who goes in to his neighbor's wife. None who touches her will go unpunished. What are the practical consequences of adultery? There's several examples if you're looking at Proverbs chapters 5 and 6. And the list is on the screen there. We'll go through them one by one. First of all, disease. Chapter 5, verse 11. At the end of your life you groan when your flesh and your body are consumed. We are under the misunderstanding, and a lot of our culture will tell us that STDs are a thing of the past, that medical technology has made it where we can have, they say, safe sex, and you don't have to worry about your behavior and the physical consequences of it. But the numbers aren't showing that. They're showing that we're still having as much trouble with diseases caused by adultery and fornication as we did in the past. In fact, the numbers on syphilis, for example, are up higher than they have been since 1950. And so this is a practical consequence. Number 2, loss of reputation. Look at chapter 5, verse 9. Lest you give your honor to others. And then verse 14 of chapter 5. I'm at the brink, he says, of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. There's something about adultery that can hurt your reputation. It's something that, according to the book of Proverbs, is very important to you. A good name, he says, is rather to be chosen than great riches. Proverbs 22, verse 1. Then there's the problem of addiction. We think about addiction in terms of drugs, but there's a sexual addiction that's also very dangerous. The iniquities, chapter 5, verse 22, the iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. Experts have looked at pornography use and how addictive it can be and compared it to the same pleasure centers in the brain that are affected by alcohol and heroin. So we have to be careful with that part of our being. Then you come to poverty. Chapter 5, verse 10. Lest your labors go to the house of a foreigner. The foreigner here would be someone who isn't your spouse. And then Proverbs 6:26, there's one rendering that says, a prostitute leaves a man with nothing but a loaf of bread. Many a foolish person has sought love in the arms of a prostitute or someone who isn't their spouse, only to become impoverished, financially destitute, having all kinds of problems they never thought about before. Then there's violence. This is chapter 6, verse 34. When you get involved in an extramarital affair, there are other people involved besides the person you're committing adultery with. And you have to think about the damage done to those people as well and the revenge they may seek. So chapter 6, verse 34 says, jealousy makes a man furious, and he will not spare when he takes revenge. Finally, there's the regret. And practically speaking, this is very obvious. Chapter 5, verses 11 and following. At the end of your life you groan. You say, how I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. There's something that seems to be, there's some kind of shame that is attached to sexual sin that we don't see necessarily in other sins. And there's a regret that comes with it if we don't stop it before it's too late. And so think about your life and think in the long term. At the end of my life, what do I want to look back and see? And of course, adultery and many other sins will ruin what we have as a goal in the end game. In addition to the practical consequences, of course, there are moral consequences. It's morally wrong. Even if you could get away with it and not carry any practical consequences, it would still be sinful in the eyes of God And so you have this in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 21. Man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. Then verse 23 says, he dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray. I know that, if I polled the audience, everyone would say, yes, adultery is wrong. We should be faithful to our spouse. I think everybody agrees on that, whether you're a religious person or not. But it helps to look at the consequences of your behavior as a deterrent, to be faithful to your spouse, to see the dangers before you get in the midst of them. Because while it's possible to overcome that, it's very difficult to be sure. That's the first major pitfall. Proverbs talks about the problem of adultery. That's not the only problem that can come up in marriage. There are many of them, and a second one that's highlighted in the book of Proverbs is contentiousness. Now, you know that Solomon wrote most of the Proverbs, and you also know his backstory. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And a lot of what he learned, of course, was inspired, but he also learned by experience. And I wonder if that number of wives was the reason why there's so many proverbs about contentiousness in a marriage relationship. I'll give you a few examples. Chapter 21, verse 9. It is better to live in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. Or chapter 21, verse 19. It's better to live in a desert land than with a quarrelsome and fretful woman. Or chapter 27, verses 15 through 16. A continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. Sounds like Chinese water torture. It's the way he saw it. Now, what he says about women can be turned around and said about the husband as well. Contentiousness is not good for a marriage relationship. Some people say every marriage needs to have a few knockdown, drag-out fights. I don't think we need to get to that point. Of course, there will be disagreements in marriage relationships, but we don't need to get into the point where there's shouting and arguing, yelling and contention and bitterness and resentment all the time. That's very bad, and it will bring a marriage to an end. And there are two things that I want to say by way of application. Number one, you're going to have conflicts. Learn to settle them peacefully. There's no reason why you can't do that. Disagreements occur, but as Christians, a husband and wife should be able to settle their conflicts peaceably. Number two, what we take away from what Solomon says, Solomon who married a lot of people that he shouldn't have married, we take away that it's hard to live with the wrong person. Before you get married, make sure you're planning to spend your life with somebody who's going to help you get to heaven, who shares your values, who cares about the Lord as much as you do, who you match with, who won't be fighting your ambitions the whole time you're married, who will join you and be a partner with you in life. That's very important. Sometimes we get so caught up in the immediate, we don't think long term. This is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. And so the time to understand that is before you take your vows, not in the midst of it. That's not time to start questioning who you decide to spend your life with. So contentiousness is bad for a marriage. So that's the negative part of it. Pitfalls for marriage. Beware of adultery and contentiousness. And of course, there are many, many other pitfalls. These are the ones highlighted in the book of Proverbs. But let's turn to the positive now. And I said before, contentiousness reminds us we need to marry the right person. Well, who is the right person? What's the ideal husband? What's the ideal wife? And Solomon goes through this. We'll start with the husbands and what he says about good husbands. And he says 4 things. Here's the first one. A good husband should be devoted. Now, in general, he says this in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 22. What is desired in a man is steadfast love, and a poor man is better than a liar. That phrase, steadfast love, is a very important phrase in the Old Testament. It's translated from the Hebrew word kesed, and it's used a lot in connection with God. And William D. Mounts, in his expository dictionary of Old and New Testament words, says that kesed, or steadfast love, is one of the most theologically important words in the Old Testament because of how it describes God. Now, when applied to God, it talks about His unyielding loyalty and His undying love for His people. And you see it declared over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament. For example, you look at Psalm 136. I didn't count how many times, but over and over and over again, the writer says, His steadfast love endures forever. And then in Lamentations 3, verse 22, Jeremiah says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. So God is always loving toward His people. And if you want to see the ideal man or the ideal husband, you look to God. And first and foremost, what do you see? You see that undying, unyielding love toward His people. That's what a husband should be for his wife. It's not restricted to the divine. Husbands should love their wives with undying loyalty. For a moment, I'll go over to the New Testament. Ephesians 5, 22 and following. Paul talks about the marriage relationship, comparing it to Christ and the church. And he says that husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the church. And think about what Jesus did for us. He died for us. He gave the ultimate sacrifice so that we could live. And He did it without bitterness in His heart. He did it while looking down at the people persecuting Him and saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that is the kind of love that husbands should show their wives. A second quality, a good husband is also peaceable. Proverbs 17:14 says, the beginning of strife is like letting out water, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. You know, it's not by coincidence that contentiousness is a pitfall of marriage. Now here you have the opposite side of it. Quit before the flood breaks out. He's talking about the image of a pipe about to burst. It's starting to leak. Shut the water off before the pipe bursts. That's the idea. You can tell when strife is beginning. You can tell when that conversation is starting to go south, right? And you can feel the temptation to keep it going. He's saying stop before it gets out of control, before it escalates. You have a choice. You can go in the other direction. Be a person of peace. We're called to peace. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which you have been called. Colossians chapter 3, verse 15. Blessed are the peacemakers, Christ said, for they shall be called sons of God. A good husband will be peaceable. Next, good husbands are leaders. In Proverbs, you have a lot of references of parents to their son. It starts out that way in chapter 1, verse 8. And throughout the book, you have parents giving advice to their son. And it's interesting that the father always speaks first and then the wife. And that mirrors the order that God has placed in marriage. I go to Ephesians 5:22 again. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, His body, and is its Savior. Now, our society looks at those kinds of teachings and frowns on it and tries to twist it and demeans what they call the patriarchy and talks about how Christian teaching is used to abuse women. And that's a very different view than what you find when you're really reading the New Testament. When you read the Old and New Testaments, you see there is order in marriage, but when the leader of the marriage is leading like Christ did, sacrificially, lovingly, peacefully, respectfully, then that kind of leadership causes a marriage to blossom and flourish. There's no abuse there when husbands lead as Christ leads. They will respect, they will hear, they will protect their wives. Finally, looking at the ideal husband, you see that he's a provider. There's no specific teachings connecting husbands to being good providers in the book of Proverbs, but you see a general instruction about the need for being industrious and hardworking and providing and being independent for your livelihood, and instructions against laziness, like Proverbs 6 through 11, where he says, go to the ant sluggard, observe her ways and be wise. The ant was an industrious insect. It's always working. You kick over an anthill, you can see how busy they can be. They can get really busy on your feet if you're not careful. And so he's saying, be industrious, be hardworking, don't become dependent on others, and earn your own wages. Provide for your family. Over in the New Testament, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, Paul says, a man who won't provide for the members of his household is worse than an unbeliever. And so the ideal husband has these traits, and they are challenging, and some ways there's a lot of improvement that we can make on that, but that's what husbands should be. And if you're someone who's not married and you're looking for a husband, this is who you're looking for. Now, he doesn't just talk about husbands, but he also talks about wives. And he says a lot of things generally. Let's turn to good wives according to the book of Proverbs. First of all, Proverbs 12 verse 4 says, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. And then also, chapter 18, verse 22 says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. And then also, chapter 19, verse 14 says, house and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. So a good wife is a concept in the book of Proverbs, and she is viewed as a blessing to a family, a blessing to a marriage. I want to take us over to the obvious place, Proverbs chapter 31, where an excellent wife is described. Verse 10 says, an excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. We're going to look at this really quickly. We're going to see the traits ascribed to the excellent wife. And I think in finding this, you'll see the perfect portrait for wives according to the book of Proverbs. So first of all, you see that she is trustworthy. Verse 11, the heart of her husband trusts in her. She's truthful, she's faithful, she can be depended on, she never lies. That's the ideal wife. Number 2, she blesses her husband. Verse 12, she does him good and not harm all the days of her life. Now, generally speaking, all Christians should be a blessing to those around them. To bless someone is to pronounce good on them. And so you see this wife blessing her husband. She speaks good of him when he's not around. She doesn't badmouth him, criticize him to her family. She speaks good things and wants the best for him and tries never to slander him in any way. Number 3, she is industrious. There's a lengthy section. In fact, the most that is said about her is how she works. Look at verse 13. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She's like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength. You can go on down and see more of this. Verse 19, she puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor, reaches out her hands to the needy. She's not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. You go through there, you see she's involved in real estate, agriculture. She seems to be a seamstress. She is a merchant. She's selling her wares. She's working hard in her home to provide clothing and bedding for her family. This is a hardworking person. It's a standard that's set really high, but it tells me that a woman can do all these things. You know, I've heard some things, it's more in the past than today, that people criticize women for working outside the home. You don't see any hint of that here in Proverbs chapter 31. Yes, in the New Testament, we're told that women are to manage their households well. 1 Timothy 5:14, they're to be workers at home. Titus chapter 2, verse 5. But they can do that while having a career. They can do that while working outside the home. It's harder, it's challenging, but it can be done. And of course, husbands need to help out in that regard. And so what we see here is someone who is hardworking, who's talented, who's smart, industrious. This is the portrait of the ideal wife. Now we continue on this. We see some of the things we already noted. In her hard work, she's generous. Notice verse 20. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. The reason she earns a living is not so she can have a mansion and a big bank account and drive the nicest car, but she works hard so that she can share with those who are in need. She's very generous. And again, we see not just something for women or wives, but for every Christian. Over in the New Testament, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, Paul says, "Let the thief steal no more, but let him labor, working with his hands, so he might have something to share with anyone who is in need." We are given the ability to make money and earn a living so that we can share with people who can't do that for themselves. You know, while there are critical things said about lazy people, that should never be applied to people who are down on their luck, or physically disabled, or sick, or infirm, unable to work, or maybe unemployed through no fault of their own. There's a lot of people in society who are hurting, and we need to be generous towards them. And you see this reflected in this portrait of this wife. Next, we see that she is strong. Verse 17, we read that a moment ago. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. Verse 25 also mentions her strength. And it takes a strong woman to do all these things we see this woman doing here in this portrait. Next, we see she's dignified. Verse 25, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. Her dress, her speech, her behavior are modest. She doesn't do anything to bring shame to her family. There's a dignity there that ought to clothe her. And we see also that she is wise. Verse 26, she opens her mouth with wisdom. Finally, we see that she is kind, because verse 26 closes saying, the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. This is rounded out. Verses 27 and following, she looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. When we look at these ideal husbands and wives, we might see a picture of someone who doesn't exist in its entirety. I understand that. You know, the standard is set really high. But it's set high for a reason. This is righteousness, the righteousness of God. This is the reality to which we strive. It's the way we want to be. It gives us something to grow toward. So don't look at this and criticize yourself and be real negative and down on yourself, but rather look at these portraits, husbands and wives, and see them as goals to work toward, challenges. And the further you get to them, the closer you get to them, the greater your marriage can be. There's always potential to do better. None of us is perfect. None of us ever fully gets there. That's where we want to stop this morning. We'll continue this evening at 5 o'clock with part 3 of this series. But I want to remind you what we said in the beginning. The reason God is so strict about marriage, and the reason why the standards are so high, is because, yes, marriage is for companionship, marriage is for love and for communication, and to have somebody to partner with you in life. But first and foremost, according to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32, a marriage is to reflect the glory of Christ and His church. Paul said, this mystery is great, but I'm speaking of Christ and His church. And what we need to do above all things in our marriages is show the world what an undying love is like. to show the world what true commitment and faithfulness is. And we can do that. To show the world what forgiveness is all about. You know, husbands and wives make mistakes, and they have to live with each other through those mistakes. And that's a perfect opportunity to show grace and mercy and forgiveness. And so we see Christ in our marriages. Let that be the way you glorify God in your life. As we come to a close and are reminded of the great love of Christ, maybe some of you out there have never obeyed Christ. You're not a Christian. You can't claim to be a child of God. You made a lot of mistakes in your life that you'd like to overcome. You see, this undying love of God, the steadfast love of the Lord, it endures forever, even to this hour, even now. No matter what you've done, you can come to Him this morning. You can become a Christian. We're prepared and ready to help you do that. If you've already started your walk with Christ, you may have stumbled. It's a common thing. All Christians falter and fail. And what God asks you to do is to come back to Him in contrition, in repentance, confessing your sins. If that is a private thing, you can pray to the Lord and repent, get back on track. He's gracious and will forgive you. If it's something that's public or something you want to ask for help with, if you need prayer, we're gathered here this morning to help you do that. And we're willing and ready and able to do it. All you need to do is come right now as we stand together and as we sing.